January 26, 1945. The eastern edge of France lies locked beneath a pale winter sky. Snow clings to the fields around the village of Holtzwihr, muffling sound, disguising movement. The air smells of cordite and frozen earth. Somewhere beyond the tree line, German infantry are forming again, boots crunching, rifles checked, voices low and urgent. The center of the American line, a single M10 tank destroyer burns. Its metal hull glows faintly orange against the white ground, smoke rolling upward in slow, heavy coils. Most men would already be pulling back. The order to withdraw has been given. The line is breaking, but one figure stays. Second Lieutenant Audie Murphy stands alone near the wreck, his breath fogging the air, his uniform stiff with frost and ash. He is 20 years old, barely 5'5", underfed by years of war. And yet, at this moment, he refuses to move. German infantry begin to advance through the trees, dozens of them, confident now, sensing collapse. Machine guns chatter in the distance. Mortar rounds thud closer. Murphy climbs onto the burning vehicle, lifts a field telephone, and calls for artillery fire on his own position. The snow begins to fall harder, and the battle that will define a legend is about to begin. By the winter of 1944 to 1945. The Second World War in Europe had entered its final, most violent phase. Nazi Germany was losing ground on every front, but defeat had not yet translated into surrender. Instead, the conflict had hardened. Every mile was contested. Every village became a killing ground. In the West, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy the previous summer and surged across France. Paris was liberated in August 1944. By autumn, American, British, and Canadian armies pressed toward Germany's western border. The expectation among many Allied commanders was that the war might end before Christmas. It did not. In December, Adolf Hitler launched a desperate counteroffensive through the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. It was Germany's last strategic gamble, intended to split Allied lines and force a negotiated peace. For weeks, the fighting was brutal and confusing. Towns changed hands multiple times. Units were surrounded. Supplies ran thin. Weather grounded Allied air power and concealed German movements. By early January 1945, the offensive had been halted. But the cost had been staggering. Tens of thousands were dead or wounded on both sides. Entire divisions were exhausted. The front stabilized not because the Germans had been destroyed, but because they had been spent, and then the fighting shifted east. Alsace, a narrow region along the Rhine, became the next pressure point. Hitler, unwilling to concede any German soil, ordered another counteroffensive, Operation Nordwind, aimed at recapturing Strasbourg and destabilizing the Allied southern flank. The terrain here was different from the Ardennes, flatter, colder, cut by rivers, forests, and frozen farmland. It was ideal for defense and lethal for exposed infantry. The US 7th Army was tasked with holding this sector. Many of its units were already worn down from months of continuous combat. Among them was the 3rd Infantry Division, one of the most battle-hardened formations in the American Army. The 3rd had landed in North Africa in 1942, fought through Sicily, endured the beaches at Anzio, and clawed its way up the Italian peninsula. By late 1944, it had been redeployed to France. Its soldiers were veterans in the truest sense, men who had survived everything the war could throw at them. But even veterans have limits. By January 1945, replacements were scarce. Equipment was worn. Winter uniforms were often inadequate. Many rifle companies were under strength, some operating at half their intended manpower. Leadership fell increasingly on junior officers and non-commissioned officers, men barely out of their teens, forced to make decisions that would determine whether their units lived or died. Among them were 2nd Lieutenant Audie Murphy, had joined the Army in 1942 after being rejected by both the Navy and the Marines for being underweight and underage. He lied about his age to enlist. By 1945, he had already been wounded multiple times and decorated repeatedly for bravery. He was known for two things: his quiet demeanor and his refusal to back away from a fight. Yet even among the hardened soldiers of the 3rd Infantry Division, Murphy did not fit the stereotype of a battlefield hero. He was small, almost fragile in appearance. He spoke softly. He rarely boasted. Some officers doubted him when he was commissioned from the enlisted ranks. Others underestimated him entirely. That misjudgment would soon prove fatal for the enemy. In late January, the 3rd Division was ordered to hold a thin defensive line near the village of Holtzwihr, a cluster of stone buildings surrounded by open fields and forest patches. Intelligence indicated German infantry supported by armor were preparing to probe the line, searching for a weak point. The terrain offered little protection. Fields were open and frozen. Tree lines provided cover for attackers. Artillery could range freely. Any unit caught in the open would be exposed to direct fire. Murphy commanded Company B, 15th Infantry Regiment, or what remained of it. Attrition had reduced the company to a fraction of its strength. Many of the men were new replacements. Others were exhausted veterans holding on through habit and duty. On the morning of January 26th, the Germans began to move, and as the first shells fell near Holtzwihr, the fragile balance between defense and collapse began to tilt. The line was about to be tested, not by strategy or numbers, but by endurance under fire. The area around Holtzwihr offered no natural mercy. The village sat on a shallow rise, bordered by flat, frozen farmland and thin strips of woodland that funneled movement into predictable lanes. In winter, those open fields became killing zones. Snow reflected light. Sound carried far. Any movement invited fire. For the defenders, this meant visibility without protection. For the attackers, it meant exposure balanced by momentum. The German forces assembling opposite the American line belonged to elements of the 198th Infantry Division, reinforced by remnants pulled from shattered units further north. Many were veterans of the Eastern Front, men hardened by years of brutal warfare. Though undersupplied and short on armor, they still possessed discipline and a willingness to press forward when ordered. Their objective was simple: break through the American line near Holtzwihr, exploit the gap, and destabilize the southern shoulder of the Allied front. Success here would not win the war, but it could force a costly Allied withdrawal, and by Germany time it desperately needed. On the American side, time was exactly what they did not have. The 3rd Infantry Division had been in near constant combat for over 2 years. Replacements arrived with minimal training, often meeting their squad leaders for the first time under fire. Weapons were worn. Radios failed in the cold. Artillery ammunition was rationed. Commanders knew that if the line broke here, there were few reserves to stop a deeper penetration. 2nd Lieutenant Audie Murphy's Company B was positioned along a shallow defensive arc near the edge of the WWII. Their mission was straightforward in theory: delay, disrupt, and hold as long as possible. In practice, it meant standing in the open with limited cover while enemy infantry advanced through woods that concealed their numbers. Murphy had taken command of the company after its previous officers had been killed or evacuated. He did not seek leadership, but it found him all the same. He was 20 years old and carried the weight of men twice his age. His authority came not from rank, but from example. He shared rations. He walked the line at night. He refused to ask anything of his men that he would not do himself. Yet even his resolve could not change the mathematics of the battlefield. Dawn broke on January 26th. German artillery began probing fire. Shells landed in the frozen fields, throwing up bursts of white and black. The first casualties came quickly, men wounded before they even saw the enemy. Communications flickered. Reports came in of enemy infantry forming up in the woods. Murphy moved along the line, speaking quietly, steadying hands, directing fields of fire. He knew the ground. He knew where the Germans would come from. And he knew that once they emerged, there would be little room to maneuver. Behind the American line sat an M10 tank destroyer. Its thin armor no match for German guns, but its .50 caliber machine gun capable of devastating infantry. It was positioned as a mobile support platform, never meant to be static for long. As the morning wore on, German pressure increased. Machine gun fire rattled across the fields. Mortars began to fall with greater precision. American soldiers returned fire, but ammunition dwindled. Casualties mounted. Then the German assault came in earnest. Infantry advanced in waves, using the trees as cover, closing the distance with alarming speed. The Americans were forced to fall back, one position at a time. Orders came down the line to withdraw to a secondary defensive position. Murphy relayed the command. His men began to pull back under fire, but as he moved to follow, he saw something that made him stop. The German advance was accelerating. If his company withdrew too quickly, the enemy would pour through the gap and roll up the entire sector. There would be nothing between them and the rear elements of the division. The decision came in a heartbeat. Murphy ordered his men to continue pulling back. Without him, he turned toward the burning M10 tank destroyer, its ammunition beginning to cook off, flames licking along its hull. Smoke rose thick and black against the white sky. The German infantry were closing in, and in that moment, the battle at Holtzwihr ceased to be about lines on a map. It became about one man's decision to stand. The moment before history narrowed to a single point. Audie Murphy was never built for war. At least not in the way armies traditionally imagined it. He stood just over 5 feet 5 inches, weighed barely 110 pounds when he enlisted, and looked younger than his years even after 3 campaigns of constant fighting. Yet within him existed a calm resolve that unnerved both allies and enemies. By January 1945, Murphy had already survived more combat than most soldiers would face in a lifetime. Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, southern France. He had been wounded twice, awarded multiple decorations, and promoted from private to officer through sheer battlefield competence. But he never lost the habits of an enlisted man. He slept where his men slept, ate when they ate, carried his own gear. He did not speak in grand speeches. When he gave orders, they were quiet and direct. His leadership came not from authority but from proximity. He was always there, close enough to share danger. At Holtzwihr, that quality mattered more than rank ever could. When the German assault intensified, Murphy did not retreat to a command position. He moved forward. He observed the terrain personally. He judged distances with the instinct of someone who had learned survival the hard way. He understood that once the enemy reached the hedgerows near the road, the defense would collapse. The men around him saw this too. They saw the German infantry moving with purpose, rifles low, supported by machine guns. They saw the snow churned by boots and explosions. And they saw their lieutenant, alone, refusing to abandon the line. Many of them, that moment defined the rest of their lives. Murphy was not fearless. Accounts from later years make that clear. He felt fear acutely, but he had learned to function inside it. He treated fear as a condition, not a command. At Holtzwihr, that discipline became contagious. Even as he ordered his men to withdraw, he stayed behind to give them time. It was a choice made without ceremony. A decision measured in seconds, and it placed him directly in the path of an advancing enemy force. The M1911 pistol was not designed to stop an infantry assault, issued primarily to officers, machine gun crews, and vehicle operators. It was a last resort weapon, powerful, reliable, but limited by range and capacity. Chambered in .45 ACP, it delivered stopping power at close distances but required deliberate shot placement and steady hands. Murphy carried one, like most officers. There is no evidence of elaborate modifications or experimental alterations. What mattered was familiarity. He had carried it through multiple campaigns. He trusted it. He knew its weight, its recoil, the rhythm of its magazine. The mythology of the moment would later exaggerate the weapon's role. In reality, the pistol was only part of what he used that day. The decisive instrument was the .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the burning M10 tank destroyer, a weapon capable of cutting down infantry at hundreds of meters, but the symbolism of the pistol endured because of what it represented. Proximity. A rifle is used at distance. Artillery kills unseen. A pistol demands closeness. It is a weapon for moments when the enemy is no longer abstract. When Murphy climbed onto the burning vehicle, he brought the pistol with him. Not because it was ideal, but because it was what he had. It was a backup to a backup, a final measure if the line collapsed entirely. That distinction matters, because the story is not about a miraculous handgun. It is about a man who refused to abandon his position, even when the tools available to him were insufficient by any tactical standard. As German infantry advanced, Murphy opened fire with the tank destroyer's machine gun, sweeping the tree line, forcing the enemy to ground. When the weapon overheated, he fired short bursts. When ammunition belts jammed, he cleared them under fire. The pistol remained at his side, a last resort should the enemy reach the hull. The fact that it never came to that speaks not to luck, but to the psychological impact of resistance. To men advancing under fire, seeing a single figure still firing, still standing, disrupted expectations. It slowed momentum. It forced hesitation, and in war, hesitation can be fatal. The Germans believed the position was collapsing. They were wrong. The next angle would reveal why, not through heroism alone, but through terrain, timing, and the fragile calculus of momentum. The battlefield at Holtzwihr was deceptive in its simplicity. At first glance, it appeared flat and open, a checkerboard of frozen farmland and low woodland. But beneath that openness lay a terrain that punished movement and magnified every mistake. The ground was hard with frost, making foxholes shallow and difficult to improve. Snow-covered old shell craters, concealing dips that could break an ankle or swallow a man under fire. Visibility was uneven, long sight lines in the open fields, sudden blindness at the tree line. Every step forward was exposed. Every pause risked being seen. For defenders, this meant that once contact was made, retreat became chaos. There was nowhere to hide. For attackers, it meant that if momentum stalled, the open ground would turn into a killing field. The weather compounded everything. The cold cut through wool and canvas. Fingers stiffened around triggers. Breath hung visibly in the air, betraying positions. Weapons malfunctioned. Radios failed. Artillery corrections took longer to relay. Murphy understood this terrain instinctively. He had fought across enough of Europe to know when ground favored the attacker and when it punished him. At Holtzwihr, the balance was fragile. If the Germans crossed the open ground too quickly, they would overwhelm the defenders. If they hesitated, they would be exposed. By climbing onto the burning tank destroyer, Murphy elevated himself, not just physically, but tactically. From that vantage point, he could see movement forming beyond the tree line. He could adjust fire in real time. He could deny the Germans the cover they needed to close the distance. The terrain did not favor heroism. It rewarded control. And for a brief window, Murphy controlled it. The German soldiers advancing near Holtzwihr were not reckless fanatics. They were professionals, many hardened by years on the Eastern Front. They had learned how to move under fire, how to probe for weakness, how to exploit hesitation. But they were also exhausted. By January 1945, Germany's manpower crisis was acute. Units were stitched together from remnants. Replacements included older men and teenagers with minimal training. Equipment shortages forced improvisation. Morale varied wildly from unit to unit. Still, their orders were clear: break the American line. They advanced cautiously at first, expecting light resistance. When they encountered machine gun fire from the M10, they assumed it was a temporary rearguard action, the kind meant to cover a retreat. That assumption shaped their response. Instead of a full assault, they maneuvered. They attempted to flank. They probed for weak points. Each delay cost them momentum, and then they realized the fire was not fading. The machine gun kept sweeping the field. Artillery began to land with increasing accuracy, guided by a voice on the radio that refused to fall silent. The expected collapse did not come from the German perspective. This was deeply unsettling. A defense that should have been broken was holding. The psychological effect was disproportionate to the number of men actually resisting. War is not decided only by numbers. It is decided by perception. And in that moment, perception shifted. The Germans began to take cover instead of advancing. They returned fire without coordination. Their attack lost coherence. What they could not see was that much of the American line had already pulled back, that the resistance came from a single point. That one man was buying time with noise, movement, and relentless pressure. By the time German commanders realized this, the opportunity had passed. Reinforcements were moving into position behind Murphy. The line was reforming, and the moment that had threatened to unravel the defense was slipping away. Leadership in battle is often measured in distance, how far a commander is from the front. At Holtzwihr, that distance collapsed to 0. Murphy was not acting on orders. He was acting on necessity. The chain of command had fractured under pressure, and in that vacuum, initiative became survival. His decision to stay did more than hold ground. It created clarity. Men retreating in confusion suddenly had a focal point. Artillery observers had a reference. Commanders further back could stabilize the line knowing someone was still fighting forward. This is how battles turn, not through grand maneuvers, but through moments when chaos is briefly denied. Murphy's actions were not reckless. They were calculated under extreme stress. He exposed himself not for glory, but because he understood the alternative, a breakthrough that would cost far more lives. When the German attack finally faltered, it did so unevenly. Units pulled back in fragments. Fire slackened. The pressure lifted almost imperceptibly at first. Then all at once. By the time Murphy withdrew, wounded, nearly out of ammunition, the line had reformed behind him. The attack had failed, and the cost of holding that line would soon become clear. The story now moves to the moment where endurance became consequence, where the outcome of those minutes shaped everything that followed. The moment did not arrive with a single explosion or a dramatic charge. It came in fragments, the kind of moment that only later reveals its weight. By mid-morning on January 26th, the air around Holtzwihr had thickened with smoke and drifting snow. Visibility collapsed into narrow corridors of grey. The soundscape became constant, the crack of rifles, the heavier thump of mortars, the metallic churn of machine gun fire echoing across frozen ground. Audie Murphy remained on the burning M10 tank destroyer. The vehicle had already been hit. Its thin armor had split open. Flames licked from the engine compartment. Ammunition inside cooked off in sporadic pops that sent shards of metal clattering against the hull. The heat was intense enough to blister paint and scorch clothing. Any rational calculation would have placed survival odds near zero, but Murphy stayed from atop the vehicle. He worked the .50 caliber machine gun with controlled precision. He fired in disciplined bursts, walking the stream of bullets across the tree line where German infantry attempted to regroup. Each burst forced men to the ground. Each pause invited return fire. He was alone in the open. Below him, the rest of Company B had withdrawn to secondary positions, reorganizing under fire. Radio operators struggled to maintain contact. Artillery units behind the line waited for coordinates. Murphy provided them. Between bursts, he spoke calmly into the field telephone, adjusting fire onto advancing German formations. His voice remained steady despite the chaos around him. Shells began to fall with increasing accuracy, bursting among the trees and breaking up enemy concentrations. The Germans responded with everything they had. Machine gun fire stitched the snow around the tank destroyer. Rifle rounds snapped past his head. Mortar rounds landed close enough to shower him with debris. One burst tore through the wrecked vehicle itself. At one point, the flames rose so high that observers later assumed the position had been destroyed. But Murphy did not move. The Germans attempted to rush the position, believing the fire must be slackening. Instead, they were met by sustained fire from the .50 caliber and the relentless impact of artillery. The open ground that had once offered them an avenue of advance became a trap. Men fell. Others crawled back toward the tree line. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Murphy was wounded during the engagement, a fragment tearing into his leg, but he remained standing. Pain became background noise. Training took over. He continued to direct fire until the German advance finally stalled. It was not a rout. It was not a dramatic collapse. It was a quiet, reluctant withdrawal. The German units disengaged, pulling back to regroup. The pressure eased. The line held. Only then did Murphy climb down from the burning tank destroyer. He was shaking from cold, shock, and blood loss. His uniform was torn and blackened. His voice was hoarse from smoke. Yet he refused immediate evacuation. He returned to his men, together. They reorganized the line. The moment had passed, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. The battlefield did not fall silent after the German withdrawal. Silence never truly returned to Holtzwihr. What followed was a strange, fragile pause, the kind that exists only when both sides are exhausted and uncertain whether the fight is truly over. Snow continued to fall. Light and steady, settling over churned earth and shattered branches. Smoke drifted low across the ground, blurring shapes into ghosts. The wrecked M10 still burned, its blackened silhouette standing. Like a marker in the open field, Audie Murphy remained. On his feet long enough to ensure the line held, only after confirming that reinforcements had arrived and defensive positions were re-established did he allow himself to be treated. Medics moved in cautiously, half expecting renewed fire. They found him pale, blood soaking into his trouser leg, his hands blackened with soot and oil. When they tried to move him, he resisted at first, insisting that others be tended to first. Eventually, the pain caught up with him. He was evacuated to a field aid station, still giving instructions as he was carried away behind him. The ground told the story. German casualties lay scattered across the snow, concentrated where the fire had been heaviest. Their advance had not merely stalled, it had been broken. The momentum they had built over days of pressure evaporated in less than an hour. For the American units along that sector, the effect was immediate and profound. What had been a collapsing front stabilized. Positions were reinforced. Artillery was repositioned. The Germans would not attempt another major push there. Commanders reviewing the situation later that day realized how close the line had come to failing. Had the Germans broken through a Holtzwihr, they could have rolled into the rear areas, disrupting supply lines and forcing a broader withdrawal. The cost would have been measured in miles and lives. Instead, the line held. Word of the stand spread quickly through the regiment. Not in dramatic language, but in quiet acknowledgement. Men spoke of the burning tank, of the lone figure firing until the last moment, of how close it had come for those who had been there. The memory was seared into their understanding of war, how it could pivot on a single decision, a single refusal to yield. For Murphy, the aftermath was almost surreal. He was evacuated to a rear area for treatment. Doctors noted his injuries and recommended rest. He refused prolonged evacuation, returning to his unit as soon as he was physically able. He did not speak much about what had happened. But others did. Reports moved up the chain of command. Witness statements were collected. The significance of the action became clear. What had appeared, in the moment, to be a desperate stand by one officer was recognized as a decisive act that preserved an entire sector of the front. In the days that followed, Allied forces resumed their advance. The German offensive in Alsace sputtered and then collapsed under sustained pressure. Operation Nordwind would be the last major German offensive on the Western Front. Holtzwihr faded into the larger narrative of the war, another name among many. But for those who had stood there, it remained something else entirely. A place where the outcome hinged on one decision. Made under fire. A moment where resolve outweighed numbers, and a reminder that history often turns not on grand strategies, but on solitary acts performed in the narrow space between fear and duty. The war would move on, but the consequences of that frozen morning would endure. In the days following the fight at Holtzwihr, the battlefield itself began to disappear beneath fresh snow and the movement of men and machines. What remained was not the wreckage, but the effect, a quiet recalibration of the front line and of the men who had held it. The German offensive in Alsace had failed. Operation Nordwind, conceived as a last attempt to destabilize the Western Allies, ended not with a dramatic collapse but with attrition and exhaustion. German units withdrew eastward, conserving what little strength they had left. The opportunity to fracture the Allied front was gone for the US 7th Army. The stabilization of the line near Holtzwihr allowed commanders to redirect attention back toward the Rhine. Momentum slowly returned to the Allied side. The war, though far from over, had tilted again within this larger shift. The events of January 26th became a focal point for the 3rd Infantry Division. After-action reports described intense enemy pressure, a temporary breakthrough, and a decisive stand that halted the advance. Commanders noted the unusual concentration of fire directed from a single position and the effect it had on enemy movement. The role of the burning tank destroyer was highlighted repeatedly, but the written reports only hinted at what the men had witnessed. Those who had been present spoke quietly about it afterward. They spoke of how close they had come to being overrun, of the sound of the machine gun echoing through the smoke, of the moment they realized the enemy was pulling back. They spoke of Audie Murphy not as a legend, but as a constant, someone who had been there when the line nearly broke. In the weeks that followed, Murphy returned to duty despite lingering injuries. He resumed command of his company as operations continued toward Germany. There was no ceremony at the front, no formal acknowledgement. War did not pause for recognition. But behind the lines, reports climbed the chain of command. Witness statements were compiled. Recommendations were written. Officers who had observed the action firsthand made it clear that what had occurred at Holtzwihr went beyond normal expectations of duty. The criteria for the Medal of Honor were exacting. Actions had to be conspicuously gallant and involve risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Few met that standard. Fewer still were documented so thoroughly. Murphy's actions did. The citation would later describe how he held off an enemy force for an hour, how he directed artillery fire from an exposed position, and how he continued fighting despite wounds. It would note that his actions saved his company from destruction and enabled them to hold their sector. But those words, formal and precise, could never fully capture the reality of that morning. The fear, the exhaustion, the raw will required to stand when retreat would have been understandable. For the men who had been there, the knowledge settled slowly. They had witnessed something rare. And for Murphy himself, the weight of that moment would follow him long after the guns fell silent. The war, however, did not pause for reflection. The front continued to move east. And with it, the consequences of what had been done at Holtzwihr spread outward, shaping battles yet to come. As winter loosened its grip on northeastern France, the war pressed forward with relentless momentum. The German army, battered and depleted, fell back toward the Rhine. Allied forces followed, crossing rivers, clearing towns, and tightening the noose around the heart of the Reich. For the men of the 3rd Infantry Division, Holtzwihr became a reference point, not marked on maps, but carried in memory. It was spoken of quietly, often late at night, when exhaustion stripped away bravado. A moment when everything might have collapsed, and somehow did not. Audie Murphy remained with his unit for several more weeks. Despite wounds that would have justified evacuation, he continued to lead until ordered out of the line. When he was finally removed from combat, it was not by his own request, but because the accumulation of injuries left little choice. In February 1945, Murphy was formally recommended for the Medal of Honor. The citation was precise, unemotional, and devastating in its clarity. It described his solitary stand atop a burning tank destroyer. It recorded his direction of artillery fire under direct attack. It noted that his actions repelled an enemy force estimated at company strength or greater. On June 2, 1945, at a ceremony in Frankfurt, General Alexander Patch presented Audie Murphy with the Medal of Honor. He was 20 years old. By the end of the war, Murphy would become the most decorated American combat soldier of World War II. His list of awards included every major U.S. decoration for valor available at the time, along with several foreign honors. But none of them, not even the Medal of Honor, fully captured what he had endured. The war left marks that were not visible on his uniform. Like many veterans, Murphy carried the war home with him. He suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress. Nightmares, insomnia, and anger followed him long after the fighting ended. For years, he slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow. Crowds unsettled him. Loud noises brought him back to the fields of France. Yet he rarely spoke of his own suffering. Instead, he became an advocate for veterans, long before the language to describe their struggles existed. He spoke publicly about combat stress, about the need to care for those who return changed. In doing so, he quietly challenged a culture that preferred its heroes silent and untroubled. Holtzwihr remained the defining moment of his service, not because of the recognition it brought, but because of what it represented. A point where fear, duty, and chance collided. A moment when one man's refusal to step back altered the fate of many. The war would end months later, with Germany's surrender in May 1945. Europe would begin the long process of rebuilding. Borders would be redrawn. Lives would move forward. But for those who had been there, January 26, 1945, never truly faded. The snow, the fire, the sound of a machine gun holding the line. It lingered, not as legend, but as memory. And from that memory, a deeper question remained. What does it mean to stand when everything else gives way? That question would echo long after the guns fell silent. History often remembers wars through maps and dates, arrows moving across continents, borders shifting in ink. But the truth of war lives in far smaller spaces. It lives in moments measured not in miles, but in seconds. in choices made when retreat is easier, in resolve found when fear is loudest. At Holtzwihr, the outcome of a sector of the Western Front hinged not on grand strategy, but on one human decision: to stand when withdrawal was permitted, to hold when collapse seemed inevitable. Audie Murphy did not change the course of the war alone. No single soldier ever does. But he altered the course of that moment, and moments, when they accumulate, shape history. What makes his stand endure is not the spectacle of violence, but the clarity of purpose behind it. There was no expectation of survival, no certainty of recognition. There was only responsibility, to the men behind him, to the line that could not break, to the quiet understanding that sometimes the difference between disaster and survival is measured in minutes held under fire. War often reduces people to statistics. Divisions advance. Casualties mount. Objectives are taken or lost. But beneath those abstractions are individuals making decisions under unbearable pressure. Murphy's story endures because it restores the human scale to events that might otherwise blur into numbers. His life after the war reminds us that courage does not erase cost. The same resolve that carried him through battle did not shield him from memory, from loss, from the long aftermath of violence. His willingness to speak about those burdens would later help redefine how a nation understood its veterans. In the end, Holtzwihr was not about glory. It was about responsibility in its rawest form, standing when standing seemed impossible, so that others could live to move forward. The snow has long since melted from those fields. The tank is gone. The gunfire faded decades ago. But the meaning remains. History turns not only on generals and grand designs, but on individuals who choose, in the smallest span of time, to hold the line. And sometimes, that is enough.